Your soulmate saying, "Please open this. Before I make the biggest mistake of my life. My beloved child. Please don't move past this yet, because somewhere behind your soulmate's silence, a decision is being made that they already fear they'll regret. They've been carrying it quietly, telling themselves it's the sensible choice, the necessary choice, maybe even the only choice left. But every time they get close to following through, one thought interrupts everything: you. Something about walking away from what they feel for you suddenly feels less like moving forward and more like leaving behind the one connection they never fully understood. And here's what makes this different: they haven't made the mistake yet. There is still a small space between what they plan to do and what they will actually choose. Don't skip, because what happened inside that space changed the entire direction of their thinking. Just when they believed their mind was settled, they remembered one specific moment with you, and that memory made them question everything. It wasn't some dramatic scene. That's exactly why it affected them so deeply. It was something small you probably didn't even realize mattered, a moment when you understood what they were trying to say without forcing them to explain every feeling. They remembered the calmness of being seen instead of judged, and suddenly the future they had been preparing for felt strangely empty. That was when the real question appeared in their mind: what if I'm about to lose something I'll spend years trying to find again? They tried dismissing it. They told themselves emotion was making the decision harder than it needed to be. Yet the more they tried to push you out of their thoughts, the clearer something became. Their biggest mistake wouldn't necessarily be choosing the wrong path. It could be making a permanent decision while hiding from the truth about why they were making it. Stay till the end, because that realization led them to admit something they had avoided admitting even to themselves. Your soulmate finally recognized that this decision was never entirely about you. Part of it came from their own uncertainty. The fear of trusting something that had become more meaningful than expected, the fear of being fully understood, and the fear that choosing you would require them to stop pretending they didn't care this deeply. But then came the detail that changed everything. Before taking that final step, they imagined what would happen afterward. They pictured the first morning when there would be nothing left to decide, no possibility to return to, no unfinished conversation waiting between you. And instead of feeling relieved, they felt one overwhelming question: why didn't I tell them the truth first? Something huge is waiting for you, because the truth they suddenly wanted to tell you wasn't simply that they still cared. It was about the real reason they had almost chosen to walk away, and the person whose words pushed them toward that decision in the first place. The truth became impossible to ignore the moment your soulmate realized how much another person's opinion had shaped their decision. Someone close to them had planted a simple question in their mind: are you sure this connection is worth waiting for? At first, it sounded reasonable. Almost protective. But those words kept returning whenever your soulmate felt uncertain, until someone else's doubt slowly began sounding like their own voice. That is why they nearly made the biggest mistake of their life. They weren't choosing what their heart genuinely wanted, they were reacting to the possibility that caring this deeply might eventually disappoint them. Then something unexpected happened. Your soulmate asked themselves one question they should have asked much earlier: if nobody else had an opinion about this, what would I choose? The answer came immediately. And it was your name. Don't skip, because that answer didn't solve everything. It uncovered an even bigger problem. Now they had to face what they had been avoiding. If they truly wanted you, why had they allowed outside voices to matter so much? The answer surprised even them. This connection had become important enough to make them feel vulnerable, and uncertainty made other people's advice seem safer than trusting their own feelings. But imagining a future without you changed that. Suddenly they remembered unfinished conversations, things they almost told you, and moments when they wanted to reach out but convinced themselves to wait. One memory kept returning stronger than the others, a moment when they almost admitted exactly what you meant to them, then changed the subject before the truth could escape. They thought there would always be another opportunity. Now they weren't so certain. Stay till the end, because this is where their decision began shifting. Instead of asking whether walking away would be easier, they started asking whether they could live with never discovering what might have happened if they had finally been completely honest with you. And that question brought them to the edge of a completely different choice. Your soulmate began mentally rewriting the conversation they had been afraid to have. Not a perfect speech. Not some dramatic confession. Just the truth. They wanted to tell you that their distance never meant you were unimportant. In fact, the opposite may have been closer to reality. You mattered enough that every decision involving you felt heavier than they expected, and they didn't know how to handle that weight without occasionally retreating into silence. But there was still one final obstacle standing between realization and action. The person who had encouraged them to move on wasn't finished talking. One last piece of information was about to be revealed, something your soulmate had never heard before. Something huge is waiting for you, because when they discovered why this person had been pushing them away from you so strongly, your soulmate suddenly understood that the advice might never have been neutral at all. What your soulmate discovered next completely changed the meaning of every warning they had been given. The person encouraging them to let you go finally admitted something they should have revealed from the beginning. Their advice had been shaped by their own past disappointment. They weren't necessarily seeing your connection clearly. They were looking at it through memories of what had happened to them, assuming your soulmate would eventually experience the same outcome. Suddenly, everything clicked. Your soulmate remembered every conversation where uncertainty had been treated like proof that the connection would fail, every moment when patience had been described as wasted time, and every suggestion that walking away was somehow the safer choice. But your story wasn't their story. Your connection wasn't their past. And for the first time, your soulmate understood the difference. Don't skip, because recognizing this didn't simply change their opinion. It forced them to reconsider the decision they were only moments away from making. That realization brought another memory rushing back, one that your soulmate had misunderstood until now. There had been a moment when you could have pressured them for answers, demanded certainty, or forced the connection forward. But you didn't. You gave them space. At the time, they wondered whether that meant you cared less than they hoped. Now they were beginning to see another possibility. Maybe your restraint wasn't indifference at all. Maybe it was respect. That thought stayed with them. It made them replay your actions instead of only remembering their own fears. Suddenly, little details started connecting. Your patience. The way certain conversations felt unfinished rather than empty. The strange sense that neither of you had truly closed the door. And then your soulmate realized something that made the decision feel even more urgent. They had been waiting for certainty before speaking, while you might have been waiting for honesty. Stay till the end, because what they decided to do next could change everything between you. Instead of following through with the choice they had planned, your soulmate stopped. Not because every question had disappeared, but because one truth had become stronger than all those questions. They could accept an uncertain answer from you more easily than they could accept never telling you what was real. So they began forming the words they had avoided for far too long. They wanted to explain why they pulled back, why other people's opinions affected them, and why the thought of permanently losing this connection finally made them recognize its value. But just before they were ready to say everything, another realization surfaced. There was one thing they still didn't know about you, and without that answer, they couldn't predict what would happen when the truth finally came out. Something huge is waiting for you, because the question haunting your soulmate now isn't whether they should walk away anymore. It's whether you still feel the same connection they were almost foolish enough to leave behind. Now everything depends on the one answer your soulmate cannot find inside their own mind. They can understand their feelings. They can recognize where they went wrong. They can even admit that outside opinions nearly pushed them toward a decision they didn't truly want. But they cannot know what has been happening inside you while they've been hesitating. And that uncertainty is affecting them more than they expected. They're wondering whether their silence made you believe they stopped caring. Whether their distance convinced you to emotionally close a door they secretly hoped would remain open. Most of all, they're asking themselves whether they waited too long to tell you the truth. Don't skip, because this is where their biggest fear transforms into something completely different. They're no longer afraid of choosing you. They're afraid that while they were trying to decide, you may have learned how to continue without them. That possibility forces your soulmate to look at their behavior differently. They remember moments when they almost reached out but decided to wait another day. Then another. They remember words they typed in their mind but never said, believing there would always be a better moment. Yet now they understand something simple and uncomfortable. Waiting for the perfect moment can quietly become another form of avoiding the truth. So they stop asking, "What if this goes wrong?" and begin asking, "What if saying nothing is what makes it go wrong?" That question changes their entire emotional direction. For the first time, they're considering honesty without trying to control what happens afterward. They want you to know that the connection mattered even during the silence. They want you to understand that their hesitation wasn't proof that you meant too little. In some ways, you meant so much that they became afraid of making the wrong move. And almost made an even bigger one by doing nothing. But there is still something they haven't told you, and this may be the most important piece yet. While imagining what they would finally say, your soulmate realized they don't want to return merely to repeat the same uncertain pattern. If they open this conversation, they want something to be different. Clearer. More honest. More intentional. Stay till the end, because this isn't simply becoming a story about stopping one terrible decision. It's becoming a decision about what happens next. Your soulmate has begun considering one specific step that would prove they're serious about changing the way they handle this connection. And strangely, it isn't the grand gesture you might expect. Something huge is waiting for you, because the step they're preparing to take is surprisingly simple. But before they take it, there is one final truth about their original decision that you still haven't heard. Those forgotten words suddenly return with a meaning your soulmate never noticed before. You had once said something simple about wanting honesty instead of perfection, and at the time, they heard it as an ordinary thought. Now they understand what may have been hidden inside it. You weren't necessarily waiting for them to have every answer. You may have simply wanted them to stop hiding behind uncertainty and tell you what was real. That realization hits differently because your soulmate spent so much time believing they needed to become completely certain before approaching you. They rehearsed possibilities, predicted outcomes, and searched for guarantees that no meaningful connection can provide. Meanwhile, the one thing that might have changed everything was much simpler: an honest conversation. Don't skip, because this is the moment they finally stop preparing for every possible ending and start thinking about the one beginning they nearly prevented. And then another detail becomes impossible to overlook. Your soulmate realizes that whenever they imagined telling you the truth, they always pictured your reaction first. Would you understand? Would you still care? Would you question why they waited so long? But now they recognize that those questions were another way of delaying the moment. They cannot control your response, and strangely, accepting that gives them courage. They decide that honesty should not be offered only when a perfect answer is guaranteed. It should be offered because the other person deserves to know what was actually happening. So your soulmate begins stripping away every complicated explanation until only the truth remains. I almost walked away because I was listening to fear more than I was listening to myself. Stay till the end, because there's another sentence they want to say immediately afterward, and that sentence reveals what they truly hope happens between you next. They don't want to ask you to forget the silence or pretend the confusion never happened. They want the chance to create something clearer from this point forward, one honest step at a time. And that is when the biggest transformation occurs. Your soulmate stops viewing this conversation as a desperate attempt to keep you and starts seeing it as an opportunity to finally respect both of you enough to tell the truth. Whatever your answer may be, they would rather know it than spend years wondering what could have happened. But just before they make that move, one unexpected thought stops them again, not with fear this time, but with recognition. There is one question they need to ask you before saying anything about the future. Something huge is waiting for you, because your answer to that single question could reveal whether this connection has truly been waiting for another chance, or whether both of you have been waiting for the exact same conversation. The question your soulmate wants to ask you is far simpler than everything they rehearsed. Did you ever want me to stay, even when you didn't say it? That question matters because they've finally realized how much of your connection was built around things neither of you clearly expressed. They remember the moments when you seemed ready to say more, then stopped. They remember conversations that ended too soon and the strange feeling that something important was always sitting beneath the surface. Before, they interpreted those moments through uncertainty. Now they're wondering whether you were doing exactly what they were doing. Protecting your feelings until you knew where you stood. And suddenly, their biggest mistake becomes painfully clear. They almost ended something based on assumptions without ever asking you the one question that could have changed everything. Don't skip, because what your soulmate notices next makes them believe your answer might not be what they feared. There was a pattern they overlooked. Even when things became uncertain, you never completely treated the connection as meaningless. Something in your words, your patience, and the way certain moments lingered suggested that the story had never received a real conclusion. Your soulmate cannot claim to know what you feel now, but they finally understand that guessing is no longer enough. And that changes their next move. They're no longer planning to approach you with a perfectly rehearsed speech or expectations about what you should say. They want to come with one thing they should have brought from the beginning: clarity. This is what I felt. This is why I pulled away. This is what I almost did. And before I make a decision I may regret, I need to know what was real for you. Stay till the end, because there's one part of that conversation they're still struggling to say out loud, and it explains why losing you suddenly feels so different from every other goodbye they've imagined. Your soulmate has finally recognized that they weren't holding on to you because they were afraid of being alone. They were holding on to the possibility that what existed between you deserved an honest chance before anyone called it finished. That distinction changes everything. They don't want to force an outcome, and they don't want to promise a future neither of you has discussed. They simply refuse to let silence make the decision anymore. But here is where the story takes another turn. Just as they become ready to speak, they remember the exact moment when they first realized you were different to them, and until now, they had never connected that memory to the choice they almost made. Something huge is waiting for you, because when they finally understand why that particular moment stayed with them for so long, they discover the deepest reason they couldn't bring themselves to close the door on you. That memory returns with surprising clarity, and suddenly your soulmate understands why it never disappeared. It was a moment when they weren't trying to impress you, protect themselves, or carefully choose every word. They were simply themselves, and somehow, you made that feel safe. Nothing spectacular needed to happen. What stayed with them was the feeling afterward. They didn't leave that moment exhausted from pretending to be someone else. They felt understood. And now, standing so close to making a permanent decision, they finally recognize why that memory kept interrupting them. They weren't only afraid of losing a person. They were about to walk away from one of the rare connections where they had felt comfortable enough to lower their guard. Don't skip, because this realization leads to something even bigger. Your soulmate suddenly understands why every attempt to convince themselves they were done never completely worked. They kept trying to create an ending intellectually while emotionally leaving the door slightly open. That contradiction followed them everywhere. One day they would decide moving forward was best, the next, one small memory would bring every unanswered question back. They thought this meant they were confused. Now they see it differently. Maybe confusion wasn't the problem. Maybe they already knew what they wanted but were afraid of what choosing it would require. Honesty, patience, and the willingness to hear an answer they couldn't control. That is why this moment matters. Your soulmate is no longer searching for certainty about the entire future. They're searching for enough courage to have one truthful conversation in the present. Stay till the end, because as soon as they accept that, they make a private decision. If they speak to you, they will finally tell you the one sentence they have repeatedly stopped themselves from saying. And those words aren't a dramatic promise. They're much more vulnerable. I didn't pull away because you meant nothing to me. I pulled away because I didn't know what to. The moment that changed everything was quieter than you might expect. There was a conversation when your soulmates suddenly realized they weren't just enjoying your presence anymore, they had started imagining you remaining in their life. That realization arrived before they were prepared for it. Until then, they could keep everything undefined, telling themselves there was plenty of time to understand what this connection meant. But after that conversation, something shifted. Your words stayed with them long after you were gone, and for the first time, they caught themselves wondering what life might look like if this became something real. Instead of immediately feeling excited, they became cautious. Because once something matters, there is something meaningful to lose. So they stepped back, hoping distance would make the feeling smaller. It didn't. Don't skip, because what happened during that distance explains why they nearly made the decision they're now desperate to stop. The more your soulmate tried to detach, the more they began collecting reasons why walking away might be sensible. Every unanswered message felt bigger. Every uncertain moment became evidence. Every outside opinion seemed to confirm what they were already trying to convince themselves to believe. But they were unknowingly building a conclusion around one missing piece: you had never been given the chance to explain your side. And now that realization bothers them deeply. They understand they were preparing to close the entire story using only half the information. What if some moments they interpreted as distance were simply hesitation on your side too? What if you were waiting for clearer signals from them? What if both of you misunderstood the same silence differently? Stay till the end, because your soulmate has stopped asking whether those possibilities are true. They've decided there is only one fair way to find out, and it requires doing the exact thing they avoided from the beginning. They have to speak before deciding. Not afterward, when nothing can be changed. Not months later, when the conversation becomes another regret. Now. And this time, your soulmate doesn't want to arrive with accusations or expectations. They want to ask, listen, and finally understand what happened between you from both sides. Yet one last realization has made this conversation even more important. Looking back, they remember something you did shortly before they became distant, something they originally interpreted as you pulling away. With everything they understand now, they're beginning to wonder whether they read that moment completely wrong. Something huge is waiting for you, because if their new interpretation is correct, you weren't quietly saying goodbye at all. You may have been giving them an opportunity to come closer, and your soulmate is only now realizing what they failed to recognize, and suddenly, that old moment looks completely different to your soulmate. What they once interpreted as you becoming distant may actually have been you stepping back just enough to see whether they would choose to come forward on their own. You stopped carrying every conversation. You gave them room. You waited. But instead of recognizing that space as an invitation to show their intentions, your soulmate assumed it meant your feelings were disappearing. That misunderstanding became the beginning of everything that followed. They pulled back because they thought you were pulling back, and perhaps you became even quieter because you saw them doing the same. Two people may have been watching each other from opposite sides of the same uncertainty, each believing the other had already made a decision. Don't skip, because your soulmate has finally recognized how one misunderstanding could have created months of questions that neither of you ever needed to carry. That realization removes the last excuse they had for staying silent. Your soulmate understands now that they cannot keep interpreting your feelings from a distance and calling those interpretations facts. They need your actual words. More importantly, they owe you theirs. So the conversation they once feared is beginning to feel necessary rather than frightening. They want to tell you, "I thought your silence meant you were finished, and I responded by protecting myself instead of asking you what was true." Then they want to listen. No interruptions. No assumptions. No trying to force your answer into the outcome they secretly hope for. Because something has changed inside them, they would rather hear an honest truth than spend another day living inside a story created by uncertainty. Stay till the end, because this is where the biggest mistake they almost made begins turning into the most important decision they've made about you. But before they reach out, your soulmate makes one promise to themselves. If you tell them there is still something worth exploring, they will not return to the same pattern of disappearing whenever feelings become difficult to understand. They will communicate. They will ask instead of assume. And they will let this connection develop through reality rather than imagined outcomes. Yet there is one final piece they haven't considered until now. What happens if you tell them you were waiting too? That possibility changes their entire picture of the future, because suddenly this isn't only about preventing an ending. It could be about discovering that neither of you actually wanted that ending in the first place. Something huge is waiting for you, because your soulmate is finally ready to reveal what they would choose if you gave them one more opportunity, and their answer is nothing like the decision they were preparing to make when this story began. This time, your soulmate's choice isn't being made from fear, pressure, or someone else's opinion. If you tell them there is still something between you worth understanding, they want to stay long enough to discover what it can genuinely become. Not by rushing into promises. Not by pretending the confusing moments never happened. They want to begin with the one thing missing from the start: clear communication. That may sound simple, but to your soulmate, it represents an enormous change. Before, whenever uncertainty appeared, they searched for an escape before searching for an answer. Now they understand that leaving would have protected them from one uncomfortable conversation while possibly creating a much larger regret. Don't skip, because the choice they're preparing to make isn't simply stay or leave anymore. They have finally realized what they actually want from you, and it's something they were too afraid to admit when this connection first became real. They want the opportunity to know you without constantly preparing for the possibility of losing you. That is the truth beneath all their hesitation. Your soulmate had been experiencing this connection with one foot emotionally near the exit, believing that staying prepared for disappointment would somehow make disappointment easier. But it also prevented them from being fully present. They questioned moments that could have been enjoyed. They analyzed words that could have simply been understood through conversation. And they allowed imagined endings to become louder than what was actually happening between you. Now they see how exhausting that pattern became. Stay till the end, because they've decided that if this door opens again, they want to walk through it differently. And there is one thing they need you to understand before anything else: they are not asking you to erase the past. They are preparing to take responsibility for the part of it they created. That means admitting something they once struggled even to admit privately: you were never the entire reason they became distant. Their own uncertainty played a much bigger role than they allowed you to see. And if they finally speak, they want to tell you that clearly instead of leaving you wondering whether you somehow caused everything. But just when your soulmate thinks they've understood the whole story, another question appears, one that could determine what happens after the conversation. They've spent so long wondering whether you still care that they never considered what you might need from them before trusting this connection again. Something huge is waiting for you, because your soulmate is beginning to realize that wanting another chance and being ready for another chance are not the same thing. And what they decide to do about that difference may reveal whether they've truly changed, or whether they're still repeating the mistake they almost made.